All right, so in this lecture, we're talking about the cardiovascular system, specifically blood. So things to be thinking about during this lecture: what kind of tissue is blood? What are the components of blood? What is plasma? What does plasma look like? What's in plasma? What are the three formed elements of blood, and what do those things do? What is the structure of red blood cells, and how does that relate to their function? And finally, the last thing to think about is, what are some of the disorders of red blood cells? What are some problems you can run into with your red blood cells? So what are the functions of blood? You should probably know this by now. Principally transportation of oxygen and nutrients to your cells, and the removal of wastes and carbon dioxide. You're going to get rid of mostly carbon dioxide, but you can get rid of nitrogen that's going to be produced by the breakdown of amino acids, and you're going to be moving hormones around too. So the principal thing here is that blood is for transportation. Inside your blood, there are things called white blood cells that travel around fighting against potentially invading pathogens. And so the other function of your blood is to move these defensive elements around so that you can stay healthy. So transportation and defense, and regulatory functions. So this is back to this idea. This is back to this idea of homeostasis. So the blood in your cardiovascular system is helping you to maintain body temperature, your water-salt balance, and your pH, all of which are incredibly important if you like living. So the principal functions of blood: transportation, defense, and regulatory functions, maintaining homeostasis. So what is blood made out of? And just a reminder here that blood is in fact fluid connective tissue. Blood is connective tissue. So there are three formed elements which are all produced in your red bone marrow. There are red blood cells, which are also referred to as erythrocytes, white blood cells, which are also referred to as leukocytes, and there are platelets, which are also referred to as thrombocytes. And we're going to go into more detail later, but red blood cells are for transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. White blood cells, or leukocytes, are for protecting your body and serving as an immune function. And platelets, or thrombocytes, are for clotting functions, to prevent you from bleeding out if you have an injury. So plasma is most of your blood volume. It's a little bit over 50%. And most of plasma is just water. So your blood is, principally made up of water more than any other single element or atom, or a molecule, excuse me. Water is a molecule, not an atom or an element. But your blood is made up of water more than anything else. And there are some salts in there, some ions that are helping you to maintain that osmotic balance, the osmotic pressure of your blood, which we're going to get into later. There are also plasma proteins, which are the most abundant organic molecules in your body. So there are three major types of plasma proteins: the albumins, which are important for maintaining osmotic. So osmotic pressure is important for making sure that everything doesn't go rushing out of your blood, or alternatively, a bunch of water doesn't come rushing into your blood. And your albumins are helping you to do that. They also have, inside your plasma, you also have globulins, which are important for transport. There are alpha, beta, and gamma globulins. Gamma globulins are actually antibodies. And so those are going to be helping with immune functions. But the main thing that these are for, well, not the main thing, but these globulins are going to be for transporting things around through your bloodstream. There are important things like you transporting hormones, transporting cholesterol, transporting iron, stuff like that. So I didn't want to just leave it, oh, they're important for transport. That's the kind of thing they're moving around. Hormones, iron, and cholesterol. And then you have fibrinogen, which is a protein that is important for the formation of blood clots. And remember, blood clots are very important because nobody wants to bleed out. So this fibrinogen is floating around in your plasma, unactive, and then it can become activated and start to clot. Obviously, you don't want it to just be floating around, ready to clot at any second. Or, you don't want it to just be clotting in your blood, plugging up your arteries, plugging up your veins. So this fibrinogen, when it becomes active, then can form a clot and help you survive. So we've been talking about the formed elements. So that was a note about plasma. But the formed elements, remember, are erythrocytes, red blood cells, leukocytes, white blood cells, and platelets. And they all come from stem cells inside your bone marrow. So these stem cells are going to form into erythroblasts, which will then form into erythrocytes, which should make some sense to you. They're going to form into lymphocytes, monocytes, and myeloblasts, which are going to form different kinds of white blood cells, which we're going to talk about later on, but in the next section. And they're also going to form these megakardioblasts, which are going to form into platelets. And so the location of the three formed elements of your blood, you should know, is stem cells inside of your bone marrow. I should also mention that stem cells are referred to as pluripotent, meaning they can change into some stuff. They can change into a lot of different kinds of cells. As you see here, these stem cells become erythroblasts, which turn into red blood cells, or that same stem cell could have just as easily turned into a platelet. These stem cells can turn into a lot of different things, but not necessarily everything. So I just wanted to put that in your head. There are different kinds of stem cells, and the fate of what those stem cells can become varies from cell to cell. So red blood cells structure itself is important for their function. They lack a nucleus, so they can't make very much protein. They have few organelles, so they're relying on basic cellular processes. They can't really do cellular respiration. Their shape makes it so that they have lots and lots of surface area. And each red blood cell contains 280 million hemoglobin molecules that bind 3 molecules of oxygen apiece. So I want you to know that each red blood cell has hundreds of millions of hemoglobin molecules. Each red blood cell has hundreds of millions of hemoglobin molecules. So this is kind of continuing on that idea. Here you have the polypeptide shape of a hemoglobin molecule, which is allowing this hemoglobin molecule to bind oxygen. And you can see here they've got these concave blood cells, which is increasing their surface area, each of which has got hundreds of millions of these hemoglobin molecules. And then you have all of these blood cells rushing through these very narrow capillaries so that they can do stuff like pick up carbon dioxide and get rid of oxygen. So I want you to know that red blood cells do not have a nucleus and have few organelles. I want you to know what the shape, I don't necessarily want you to know the word biconcave, but I want you to know that their shape is helping them to increase their surface area, and again, that each red blood cell has hundreds of millions of hemoglobin molecules. So you might kind of be thinking to yourself, like, these blood cells are picking up carbon dioxide, and it's a bit of an abstraction. How do these things actually transport carbon dioxide through your bloodstream? Well, most of it is transported as a bicarbonate ion. It's a bicarbonate ion, and the red blood cell is actually where that transformation takes place. And then 25% is bound to hemoglobin in your red blood cells. It's actually bound to those tiny little molecules. And 7%, it just floats through the blood plasma as carbon dioxide. So kind of like a soda pop, like it's just floating around in there. Although the reason that only 7% is floating through your blood plasma, the reason that more is not floating through your blood plasma is because if there was any more than 7%, it would actually form bubbles. And bubbles in your blood, if you know anyone that's a scuba diver, bubbles in your blood is a really, really, really bad thing to happen to you. So again, most of the carbon dioxide in your blood is traveling via this bicarbonate ion. Let me get my that is, so the carbon dioxide is converted to bicarbonate inside the red blood cell. Only 25% is actually bound to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, and 7% is just dissolved carbon dioxide in the plasma. I don't necessarily want you to know the details of this equation. It's just showing that carbon dioxide combined with water makes carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is going to release this hydrogen ion and this bicarbonate ion. And this bicarbonate ion is going to be principally the way that carbon dioxide is traveling through your blood. So again, red blood cells or erythrocytes are produced in your bone marrow. They have a lifespan of 120 days, about 4 months. Erythropoietin, which is secreted by the kidneys, tells your body that it needs to make more red blood cells. So erythropoietin tells your body that it needs to make more red blood cells. And, you know, since these things only have a lifespan of 120 days, your body is constantly breaking down and making new red blood cells. So the spleen and the liver are going to break your old red blood cells down and break them into their various components, and you're going to excrete them through a series of different pathways. You're going to recycle parts of them, you're going to sweat some of them out, you're going to pee some of them out, and you're going to make new ones. And this is the chemical that tells your body it's time to make more. So if your blood level is, or your blood level, if your oxygen level in your blood is low, your kidney increases the production of this erythropoietin chemical. Stem cells are going to then increase production of red blood cells. Here's a picture of a bone with the bone marrow with the stem cells in it. Your oxygen levels will hopefully return to normal, and then the oxygen, you know, the oxygen level in your blood returns to normal, and you just have a normal O2 blood level. All right. So again, you have low oxygen, you create this erythropoietin in your kidneys. That causes your stem cells to increase red blood cell production, and then hopefully your oxygen levels can go back to normal. Now, obviously, this isn't always the problem. Sometimes you don't have enough oxygen for reasons other than you don't have enough blood, but this is the pathway that shows what happens if your oxygen levels are too low. So this brings us to this next issue, which is kind of an interesting one, which is, what is blood doping? Perhaps you've heard of athletes undergoing this blood doping process. I don't know if it was Lance Armstrong. I don't know if he was specifically the one that did this, but it's a method of increasing the number of red blood cells. And it allows more efficient delivery of oxygen, and it makes you less tired. And what they do is they just take that erythropoietin, that EPO, as it's also called, and they inject it into you way before an athletic event. So you produce a bunch of extra red blood cells. You produce a whole bunch of extra red blood cells. They take a bunch of blood out of you, and they spin it down, so they're just getting those red blood cells out, those components that are going to help you transport oxygen, and then they put it back into you before the event, and it gives you more energy, and it makes you a better athlete. The only problem here, you might think that's a pretty innocent thing, but the only problem here is that it can cause you to die because your blood is too thick. There's too much of those red blood cells. Athletes have died of heart attacks when attempting to perform because their cardiovascular system is just getting clogged up. It's just too thick. So I definitely want you to know that blood doping is when they inject you with erythropoietin or EPO to make sure that you're increasing the amount of blood that you're producing. And I also want you to know it's bad. It can give you a heart attack. It's not a good thing to do. So a few disorders that involve red blood cells. That would be anemia. It basically just, anemia means you just don't have enough hemoglobin, or you don't have enough red blood cells, and you just kind of feel tired. You just feel really tired all the time. Then there's sickle cell anemia, and as the name anemia implies, there's something going on with your red blood cells. Sickle cell anemia causes your red cells to become sickle-shaped and deformed, and it makes you sick, basically. It just makes you not feel well. The interesting thing about sickle cell anemia is that it also makes you resistant to malaria, and that is thought to be the reason that sickle cell persists in modern populations, is because, well, you know, would you rather have some sickle cell or would you rather die of malaria? Well, I personally would rather just have some sickle cell. And then this last disease that we're going to talk about is hemolytic disease of the newborn, which has to do with your mother and child having different blood types that cause the mother's immune system to mess up the blood cells in the baby before and after the baby is born. And there are certain modern things that can be done about this, but this can definitely be problematic if the mother and child have different blood types.